Video games, comic books. Video games, comic books. Video games, comic books. Both of which are able to take the buyer to a new world in a way that most other mediums struggle with. But what about merging the two? Well, I suppose you could look at the previously mentioned Quest Probe series, pictures displaying the action whilst the player needs to continue the story by working out what happens next. But let's face it, they are pretty dated, and you're going to struggle as a new player to find enjoyment in something like this unless you're a hardcore fan. What about making a video based around the idea of a comic? A popular genre with you, the player, actually playing inside the comic. Introducing Comix Zone. Did I say introducing? Haha, this game needs no introduction. Probably the very last game I got for my trusty Mega Drive before jumping into the new generation of polygons and loading times. A kick-ass little game idea that sadly hasn't had much love since its first outing on the Great Black Beast. But either way, it is fondly remembered by the masses, me included, and that's why I've decided to give it its time in the Slopes Game Room Complete History Spotlight. So, join me as we look into this game's pretty damn long development, the creator, the game itself, and of course, the ports. Welcome to Slopes Game Room. The year is 1995. The Mega Drive, although far from dead, was most definitely on its last legs. Sony had entered the video game market with a brand spanking new Sony PlayStation, and Sega themselves had actually already released the Sega Saturn. But all you gamers know it's the very end of a system's life when you can actually see what sort of crazy techniques have been discovered throughout its lifetime. And some of the most technically impressive games can still make it onto the system's essential list. Comix Zone is one of those games. But before we go ahead, I think we're in fact getting a little ahead of ourselves. So, let's go back to the beginning. Here we are, back at the Sega Technical Institute, aka STI, in 1992. Peter Morroway was working on Sonic 2 and Sonic Spinball with Sonic Team at the time, when he originally came up with the familiar concept. Peter was always a big fan of comic books growing up in Czechoslovakia, however, not the comics you would expect, but instead the comics that I grew up with, such as Asterix and Tintin. It was only after emigrating to America in 1989 that a whole new world of comics opened up to him, and the idea of a comic book artist trapped inside his own creation video game started to take shape. His mind raced with excitement, and over time, the ideas for what his comic-based game would be like became far more structured. The only problem was that his English wasn't all that great, and he somehow needed to pitch the idea to a group of Sega officials. If he didn't get it right first time, it's very unlikely that the game would ever be made. So what did Peter do? He ended up actually creating a game concept. Not on the Mega Drive, but instead on the Commodore Amiga. What you are seeing here is an early concept video of the game that Peter created, which he then showed to the suits at Sega. Joe Pencil trapped in the Comix Zone. Now before going on, if the art style in this clip seems quite familiar, then it may be because he also worked on the promo concept art for the Sonic Sat-Am game. However, that game, as you no doubt know, never made it. Anyway, back to Comix Zone. As you can all see, the game's design didn't actually change too much from this initial pitch, and when the Sega Technical Institute showed off the games, Tom Kalinske, Sega's head at the time, loved it. However, it wasn't long after that the team started working full pelt on other Sonic the Hedgehog games, and all of the focus on the upcoming Joe Pencil game was put on hold until those games had finished. Which, let's be honest, is fine by me, because whilst waiting for this game, the company made these classic games. Yeah, okay, maybe not Sonic Spinball, I could have lived without that one, but Sonic 3 and Sonic & Knuckles, not a bad compromise if I do say so myself. Anyway, after all this, the team only had 1 year of Mega Drive life left before the new system was put in place. As you can expect, this is when in-house development companies need to start knuckling down on the new hardware. Time was indeed running out for Comix Zone. So, Comix Zone was the very next project, and no time was wasted in turning Joe Pencil, trapped in the Comix Zone, into simply Comix Zone.
Test 1, 2. SEGA.
As soon as the game loads up, you know it's going to be something special. The stylistic SEGA logo with synthesized voices giving a check 1, check 2 welcomes you, and the sexy 90s grunge style music arranged by the Mega Drive's classic 16-bit sound chip makes for a very iconic sounding game. New York City, present day.
Look at me, Sketch. I'm just a drawing. But I'll be free soon enough. As soon as you're dead, I cannot kill you here. But I know a perfect place to do it. Have a nice trip.
And there you have it. Besides Streets of Rage and Revenge of Shinobi, this has got to be one of the coolest intros for the system. You fall into the comic and no messing about, it's time to start the game. Straight away you can see that the game has a crazy amount of style. Obviously the Mega Drive could never voice all the parts needed for this sort of game, but because it's set inside a comic book, speech bubbles actually work better here. You see, Comix Zone is one of those SEGA games that just oozes a unique, cool SEGA style that no other game has been able to beat in the same genre. The jump from panel to panel, the way you choose the path of which way to go, the way that the bad guy is drawing enemies right in front of you, and the way you can smash those enemies through several panels to the other side. Everything comes together to make a solid game that is pretty hard to not get caught up in. This is what I remember about Comix Zone. Sadly, playing the game for the first time in many years, well, time hasn't been too kind. Now, Comix Zone is still a good game. Controlling Sketch Turner never feels awkward or sluggish, it plays fine. But, and maybe this is the new age me talking, the game is bloody hard. Life pickups are few and far between, and the enemies you go up against can sometimes be a bit cheap in their attacks. If you've never played the game before, or you're like me and it's been a long time since you've played it, then you may be surprised at just how unforgiving this game is. However, get good at it and suss out all those attack patterns, and what you have is a game that is still well worth playing and watching. There is just so much going on in this game that whilst playing it, you're most definitely going to be missing out on a lot of stuff, giving the somewhat short game some much needed replayability. Especially if you're playing on the 6-button controller, making it far easier to assign different objects to each button. The music, like I already said, is absolutely stunning. Made by the same guy who made Sonic Spinball before helping out with Sonic 3 and Knuckles, Howard Drosin. He even worked on the previously mentioned 2010 reimagining of Splatterhouse. A guy after my own heart. What's pretty cool about this is that some of the games actually came with an audio CD full of real grunge music by a band put together by Howard. However, this is a very limited run, and finding the game complete with the CD has become quite tricky. According to Peter, the reason for this is simply the marketing team decided against it after it went out. Or I suppose you can get the Comix Zone SEGA Tunes CD, but that is even rarer. Essentially, Comix Zone is really just a side-scrolling beat-em-up. Think Double Dragon, Streets of Rage, that sort of thing, and you're on the right track. However, in an overpopulated genre, Comix Zone brings something new to the table with its love letter to comic books, and sadly, it has never had a sequel. Even though Peter worked on some concept art for a second game, it never went any further than this image. During its release, Microsoft was pushing out Windows 95 as a way of playing games over DOS, and Comix Zone actually made its way onto PC CD-ROM. In fact, it was the first of the SEGA PC ports, but other than getting it for the box alone, it's a standalone port, running at the same 320 by 224 resolution, so there really isn't anything to see here. Plus the audio is nowhere near as nice as it is on the Mega Drive. And other than this, you have the Game Boy Advance port, which should be great, but as you can guess, it was total crap. Thankfully, even though the Mega Drive original was quickly rising in price, the game can be found on pretty much every Mega Drive collection going, as well as standalone downloads on Xbox Live Arcade, Steam, PlayStation Network and the Virtual Console. In other words, it's very easy to go and find and play this game. Which you should do. Comix Zone is a legendary game. A game that many instantly think about when talking about Sega's entry into the 16-bit generation. Again, it's not a brilliant game, it has its flaws, but personally I see them more as learning curves, and if you can get past them, then you will see what all the fuss is about, as you take control of Sketch Turner in the Comix Zone. Hey guys, thanks for watching. Firstly, a special thanks goes out to Ryan Burford, Ian A. Chapman, Phil Lowlins, Ben Hall, Taylor Ullman and Ted Kimmel, as well as all the Patreons that help contribute to make these episodes. If you want to check out my Patreon and get exclusive rewards, then click the link on the screen. Don't forget to subscribe and check that bell to be notified of all future episodes, and if you want to check out previous videos, then you've got the links on the screen to do that too. But for now, that's it from me. This is DJ Slope signing out, and hopefully I'll see you all next time.